Hello, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
This is Dan,
And Nicole.
and we are starting here the first edition of our very own book club. And this time around, we are going to do
2,000 years ago.
great. And I think we want to, before we talk about the book, we want to talk a little bit about this idea. It seems a little bit last minute to some folks because it is. We do a book club here at home, and we like talking about the story. And we mention it to a couple of people, and they say, "Oh, I really wish I could be there, but I can't make it." So we had this idea of like, why don't we just
To
open
a
it up?
virtual book club, which is almost as good as being here in our house because you sort of are. And
You are.
with that, we should give a quick warning. We do have two small children.
Yes.
And we're recording this live and actually recording it after our kids have gone to bed. But any of you out there that have small children, you know, children wake up. So at any given time, you might just see one of us.
We might get visitors, or we might get visitors.
So that's just a little bit about our life, but we welcome you to our house. We're excited to talk to you about this book, which was written in 1939 by Francisco Candido Xavier. And maybe you want to talk a little bit more about the book. You do a really good job with that.
Oh, sure. I can try to do that. So this is a great book. It's a novel by the spiritual author Emmanuel. And it was psychographed, as we like to say in Spiritism, which means it was written to automatic writing by the medium Francisco Xavier that we talked about. And it never ceases to amaze me that this book is from 1939. It's 80 years of age. And it's a wonderful story about Emmanuel himself. And we can jump straight into our introduction in a little bit. But we picked this book because it's been a very long time since I last read it. I'm talking about more than 15 years, I think.
I've had a really different experience with the book. So full transparency, part of the reason why we picked this book is because I have now read chapter 1 probably 4 or 5 times, and I just can't get past it. I actually get stuck in the introduction, which Daniel finds moderately interesting, and I have found incredibly hard to get through. So part of you being part of our book club is almost being like accountability friends to me, because I need your help finally finishing this book. I have read other books by both the medium and the spiritual author that I've really enjoyed, but for some reason this book has just never made it through. So thank you for being part of my accountability team to make it through this book. Daniel.
And I just really love having Nicole's insights into these things. It's just a wonderful thing to be able to get somebody else's perspective on what you're reading, and you have a lot of aha moments. I didn't think about that. And naturally we gravitate towards different things, which really just means that we get a more rounded view of the entire book.
Yep. Right? And you should also know that I am reading a hard copy. Daniel is reading on his Kindle. So you might hear me refer to a specific page number. That's just to drive Daniel crazy so he can go find things. But if you want to follow along, my version is the newest edition of the book that you can get on Amazon. So
yes, and we can talk about this as well. We also put a link to the book in case you need to get it inside the website, and we are getting the recordings that we do every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Pacific time, because we just talked about our kids, right, and having to sleep, so that's the time. Kind of can't move that very well. But you can find these recordings after the fact, and we're going to put that on Spiritism Online, which is a platform for all different kinds of Spiritist courses. And if you go in there, you'll find a course called Book Club, 2,000 years ago. Just sign up, and you will find the links to the books. You'll find discussions and forums, and you'll find the recordings for these sessions, as well as the link to the next sessions, should you be able to participate. And we want to make sure that you know that the conversation doesn't just happen here, that if you can't make the time, you can go in there, type your questions in, participate, be a part of it. We really think that this could be a rich experience when everybody participates. Yep.
So hope you can join us. My question, again, having read the introduction and chapter 1 multiple times, I don't know. Tell me, Daniel, you know, we have an introduction by the publisher, which is really unusual. I mean, I love reading, but I can't remember a book that had an introduction by the publisher.
It's a great question. Great point, actually. And I think that this book is such an interesting one to have an introduction by the publisher, because in many ways, if you think about it, in 1939, the idea of spirit communication was way more taboo than it would ever be today. And so I think that clarity is really interesting, because it kind of helped me connect to the book a little bit, because the introduction is about why this book came about and who this book is about, right? So we know that the author is Emmanuel, and that this is a novel. But what we sometimes miss if we don't get that introduction, that this is actually a novel that is not an invention of fiction. This is actually a recounting of Emmanuel, the author's real life 2,000 years ago, at the time of Christ. And that's why I find it so interesting, because I think it draws you in that the author is saying, let me show you how my life was and the mistakes I've made. So maybe you can learn from this.
Yeah, which I think there's an interesting quote on page 8, paragraph 2, where he says, I shall tell you about the proud patrician, Publius Lentulus, so that you may learn something from the dolorous experience of an indifferent and ungrateful soul. You know, just the humility struck me that he refers to himself. You know, here is somebody that, if you follow Spiritism, if you've read other books, Emmanuel is a really enlightened individual. And the fact that he spoke about himself, one in the third person, but as this indifferent and ungrateful soul, you know, looking back at, like, here's who I used to be. I was this indifferent and grateful person. And he keeps that humility. And it really struck me that his goal was, on the next page, page 9, first paragraph, was to teach humility and faith to those around him. What a great opportunity.
Yeah, and he goes a little bit forward too, and he says, now you will be able to verify the extent of my failures in the past, which is, I think, really interesting, because we all know in Spiritism, Emmanuel as the spiritual mentor to the great Brazilian medium, Francisco Xavier, who really is really well known within the Spiritist community. So we have this idea generally of Emmanuel, this incredible enlightened spirit. And here he is telling us, come into my past and look of how I screwed this up.
So that quote, my confession may be a guideline for all. So beautiful. It's
a beautiful thing, right? So I think that, so in that sense, the introduction kind of drew me near to the book, because it really tells us that, hey, the story we're about to read is not a fictional invention. It's not been dramatized. It's actually somebody's real life. And this that happened, 2,000 years ago, which I think is a very suggestive title.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that the perk of that, if you like that kind of stuff, is you do get a little bit of historical perspective, because there will be some description of how the times were, the houses were at that time. So if you're interested in the Roman period, so to speak, of the empire, you're going to get a little bit of that, which might be something great for some people. It might be difficult for others. We are going to get some difficult names, right? Some different names.
Which, by the way, if we stumble upon something and you find a better way to pronounce it, or you find some details, let us know in the classroom setting that we have. Put it on the discussion boards. Like I said, this is our book study at home. We don't prepare for this. There's sort of no script anywhere. You see me still looking at my book, looking for quotes. I like annotating my book, so you see sort of notes all over. That's just how I read.
Yeah. And we are no authorities either in Roman times or in the story itself. We are just learners. We're just learners who really want to explore this together.
Yep.
And I would also say that one interesting thing we're going to find out in chapter 1 is that Emmanuel, the spirit, and this story about is actually about a verifiable historical figure. So there are actually records about the main character of this book, which is Publius. Publius Lentulus, a senator of Rome. And what I find really interesting, to kind of dive into this a little bit, if I may, is historians say that there are really just two there are just two witnesses, or there's just two proofs that the historical Jesus really existed as a person. One of them is the Jewish historian Josephus, who writes about a prophet at the time called Jesus that was doing these things. And the other one is this certain Roman senator who writes a letter to Caesar to narrate his encounter with the Christ. And he happens to be called Publius Lentulus. So it's a fascinating piece because you're actually reading about a historical fact. It gives me a little bit of chills because these are some of the indications that the Christ actually was physically present, that it was not just an invention of a group of people. Conversations for another time, perhaps, right?
Indeed.
All right, so the introduction really is about that. Do you find other things in there that you might want to talk about?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I could go on and on. I don't want to get stuck in the introduction. But I was wondering, you know, on page 11, which is the second to last page of this introduction, you know, he sort of thanks God for his kindness, talks about, you know, I did not perceive that you were watching, this idea that God is always there. But then he goes to talk about the teachings of the Samaritan woman. And, you know, I know the stories of the Good Samaritan, and it's a man who gives away things. And I don't remember a story of the Samaritan
woman by the fountain, right?
I don't remember that story.
So it's one of my favorite stories of the New Testament. I find it so poetic. I really should have actually dug it up for us to kind of look into, to read it. But
maybe we can post it in the classroom.
Maybe that's a great idea. We should do that. We'll put a link to the gospel so you can kind of read it in there. And
I feel like the cool thing to do, like when David, our son, watches these YouTube videos, people always go like, look in the comments for the link. I always wanted to do that. So look in the comments for the link.
Hold on, can I do that too? Can I do that too? Look in the, yeah, there you go.
Or a link to the Samaritan
I know,
woman.
maybe we can do like an overlay, even in a video later, you know?
Tell them the story.
But so the story about the living fountain is one of the most, I think, in my opinion, poetic and touching stories of the New Testament, because Jesus is hanging out by a famous old fountain and you might remember in that day, I mean, you might recall this in the desert in those days, not that you were there, but
maybe, who knows?
Desert, right? So water is important, and they have this great fountains along the way. And this fountain was a well-known historical fountain where people would go and kind of scoop their water out. And the disciples tell Jesus, hey, you know, we're going to get food and we'll be right back. And he decides to stay for whatever reason that only Jesus knows. And this woman comes, and she's a Samaritan woman, right? So a Samaritan was like an ethnicity that was not very well regarded by the Jews. So it was looked down upon by the Jews. So here's Jesus, who is a full-fledged Jew, and here's a Samaritan woman who comes to get water on the same fountain. And it was a big no-no for men to speak to an unaccompanied woman, and vice versa, right? There's already like a social barrier there. And on top of that, Samaritan woman, which the Jews regarded as inferior or less worthy. And so in the middle of that, she comes and tries to get the water, and he asks her, hey, woman, give me some water. And she is shocked, and she says, wait, basically, hold on a second. Who are you? Why are you asking a Samaritan woman for help, right? And he comes back to her and says, basically, you know, give me some water again. And she's like, who died and made you boss? Basically, just she has a little bit of like an attitude to her, which I love, right?
Sassy, I like it.
A little bit, yeah, I think so. And he does that again, and I imagine the energy comes through when he tells her that if she knew who he really was, she would be the one asking him for water. And that the water that he has to give to people is the water that not only quells our inner thirst, but transforms us into living fountains for all eternity, right? So it's a really beautiful passage that says, when you get the spiritual reality and the teachings of Christ, not only will you satisfy all your cravings for understanding and life, but you too will become a fountain for others. So in many different ways, we are going to figure it out that that's what's happening here. And it's a beautiful symbolism, right? So here is Emmanuel saying that his hope is to also bring that kind of nourishment for other people in different ways.
And I think I just made a connection. This is the great thing about talking about books. Doesn't Emmanuel have another book that's a compilation of biblical excerpts that's actually called The Living Fountain?
He does. Yeah, he does. Yes.
So
right.
Interesting.
There's a series. There's a series of little books, right? There's like Daily Bread.
living fountain.
Yes. The truth and the path and the way. So that's where it comes from. It's a series of teachings that continue to give it to you of learning and everything else. So fascinating introduction, because it is really about a book. I mean, I can't stress this enough. This is a book published in 1939. This is by World War II. This is like right before World War II. Put that in time.
Yeah.
Right. So there's lots of things going on over here that are really incredibly fascinating, and we don't want to do any spoilers here, but there's going to be so much of the story that kind of unfolds and does different things.
Yeah, no spoilers. I've only read chapter 1.
No spoilers.
One of the things actually did to help me with chapter 1, I found that there was a lot of names, and so I made myself notes on the inside cover of chapter 1 with all the names, because there were foreign names. I was having a hard time remembering them. And maybe as the story goes on, we can put some notes together. That would be really great, because these names, they were like overlapping.
They are hard. Yeah, there's like a lot of genealogy, right? There's a lot of different, like who's married to who, because it helps you understand. And that was also very important back in, I mean, still, some people still get hung up on that these days, but especially back in the day when you were of noble blood, so to speak, and these families who were considered almost like, not royalty like we call it today, but they were of noble birth, of which Publius is one of them. It becomes really important for you to see how also the Roman Empire was governed and how things took place. So I think one of the cool things is if we do that, and we'll post that in the links too at Spiritism Online, is we'll continue to draw those as we move chapter to chapter, so that we don't overwhelm people as well. I think it's a great idea.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
Do you want to offer folks a summary of the book? You're always a lot better at being succinct than I am.
I mean, of the chapter, you mean?
Sorry, yes, chapter 1.
Yeah. So chapter 1 is called Two Friends. And this is really when we meet Publius, right, for the first time. And this chapter really is about setting the tone for the whole book. And this is where we meet him, and he's a senator of Rome. So he's a pretty important guy. Senators of Rome were the elite of the Roman Empire, to such an extent that only certain senators of Rome, for instance, were allowed to wear the color purple on their togas. And that kind of sets them apart. And he's a young man. He's probably like 29, maybe 30, relatively speaking. And he's talking, and the whole chapter takes place in his house. It's one big scene, so to speak. And he's talking to his friend, who also happens to be a Roman senator, Flaminius, right? Who is older than he is, right? And it's a really interesting chapter because it sets the scene. It tells about life. We can go into that a little bit, Roman life. But it's about Publius opening his heart to Flaminius about this very vivid dream that he has had, that has had a tremendous impact on him. And it's fascinating because this dream is very vivid, and basically he opens himself up to his friend and says, this dream leads me to believe that I might be the reincarnation of somebody that lived before. So, and he has trouble then reconciling that idea, because obviously that goes in direct opposition to the religious and political ideas of the time as a Roman senator. Because he even says that this is the mumbo jumbo that the Greeks and other people have a think about reincarnation. This is not what the Roman gods are about.
The talks with servants or something.
This is what weak people and weak societies think about, because the Romans don't have time to do that because they are the emperors of the world, kind of thing. So I think that's kind of the scene to all of this. Does that help? Does that make sense?
I actually marked on page 27. He said, I could be Publius Lentulus Sura reincarnated.
Yes.
Which is his great grandfather.
It's his great grandfather, right? So should we dive into the dream then and start right there, or do you want to go back to everything?
Let's do it.
So the dream, right? Straight to the dream. Okay. So yes. So let's just start by saying that, wow, he is opening himself to his friend. Nevertheless, he's still a senator of Rome, and it's really hard for you to open yourself and expose yourself as a very important figure to another person, because that could be used politically against you, right?
Especially an older person.
Yes.
I mean, in some ways, when you hear the dialogue between the two, it seems like you almost sees him as a mentor, right?
Yeah, yes, I feel like that too. And I think that
Publius is in his 20s, and I think Flaminius in the chapter is 45 years old.
Yeah,
so
it's a difference.
It's someone that's more
seasoned.
Mm-hmm. Yet he goes into this story, and part of the reason why he goes into it, isn't it because his daughter is sick?
Yes.
And he's worried about what is going on, and he's on the search for meaning for what is happening with his daughter.
Yes. He has a young daughter, right? We learn in the story he has a young daughter, Flavia, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I gotta go back and look at the names.
Flavia is his daughter. She's 7 years old.
She's 7 years old, and she has some sort of ailment or condition that they don't know about. He obviously has taken her to the best doctors, even traveled to different places, and they find out, or they think, that it's actually leprosy, which is the most stigmatized illness that you can think about at the time, because there's no cure for that, basically. And it's basically a poor person's illness. And here is a senator of Rome. There is no more powerful people other than the Caesar, right? Who has a daughter. How could she possibly have gotten or have developed this condition? Because obviously she doesn't interact with the lower classes, right? Other than by passing by. So there is a lot of stigma attached to that for himself too. But at the same time, it's his daughter.
Yeah.
Right. So he's go through all this, and he starts thinking about there. I think there's a hint there of like, could it be that my sins, like could it be that my previous life has caused my daughter, are the gods or are the universe punishing me through my daughter because of this, right? Which is a fascinating thing. And it's really, and you can see the closeness too with Flaminius, because Flaminius reminds him that Flaminius has 2 kids too, I think.
Two boys.
And he reminds him that he hopes that one of his 2 boys will marry Flavia, so that to continue to interlock, because all of these Roman families were also about power and everything else, right?
Yeah.
So it's a really difficult thing, because through all of this, we see that he's really opening himself to Flaminius.
And I love how he talks about it. He said, when he explains this, he said, there's something that on page 20, familiar to my spirit, but which I had completely forgotten. So it's just beautiful. Like he talks about this dream space, but he's not dreaming, but he says, something that is familiar to my spirit, but which I had completely forgotten. He doesn't talk about, this is my past life memory, or this is, a dream that I had, but really talks about like something that is in his body and is true, which I just thought was really cool.
Yeah. And wow, there's so much to talk about. I don't even know where to go here. Where do we go?
So what I really like is, you read books about old times, and you know me, I'm a little bit of a social justice warrior. And so like the role of women in literature always really interests me.
Yes.
And I was really excited by the role of his wife, Livia, and that she's kind of the rock in all of this. He talks about these like bad experiences, things that he's done in his past that he's not proud of, and then talks about almost like after that incarnation. He doesn't talk about it as an incarnation, but he's like, after that life, Livia is the one that sort of holds his hand and says like, let's move forward.
And that's the interesting piece, right? Because the dream is not just about his past life. So let's talk about the dream. He has this recollection that he is this consul, this very powerful person who is embroiled in the middle of a political coup, and has
with Cicero, which is actually a name that I recognize from history, from philosophy, right?
And that he has a lot of people killed for political reasons, and an attempt to basically kind of like do a coup and take control over the whole thing with another famous figure as well. And Cicero eventually is one of those who stops them. I think is able to do that. Cicero is very famous, orator. Oh, look at that. So what I think was
I did
really,
my homework.
look at that. He was a great, he's known for his orations, for his speeches to this day. Very smart, very intelligent, very eloquent, wrote quite a bit as well. But what's interesting is not only does he remember the dream, he then goes on to remember that he died, and he remembers the in-between dreams. He remembers going to the spiritual realm after his life and having a conversation with a spiritual mentor saying, yeah, you didn't do really great, but we're going to give you an opportunity to go back and really detach yourself from this desire for power and affinity.
So this was interesting to me because usually we think of, if somebody does something bad in their past life, they come back poor, they come back, suffering. We don't think of them coming back with significant amount of status. And what was interesting to me on page 23, it talks about like the spirits telling him when he returns, you will be endowed with intelligence and health, fortune and authority as resources for your soul's integral regeneration. For the time will come in which you will be compelled to despise of all riches and social status. But it was fascinating to me, like, not only is he, he's rich, he's intelligent, he's got resources, he's probably even good looking. I mean, like the fool's got everything.
He's got everything going for him, right?
And the spirits sort of say, like, we're going to give you all of this, which is such an interesting reminder of not judging someone's current situation and linking it to their past situation. So often we see somebody suffering or we see somebody not well off and we go, oh, well, in their past life. But here's this guy, and we haven't read very much yet, but I'm assuming that there's going to be some sort of struggle. And we know that he's done bad things in the past, yet the spirits tell him, you will be endowed with intelligence and health, fortune and authority. So neat. And
because he has to learn how to properly deal with that, because his problem was he's overly attached to all these things. So how can he learn about letting go, right, if he's not exposed to the same scenario again? So in many ways, wealth and fortune is great. It's a great trial.
I wouldn't know.
Yes, I know. We just have good looks.
But I'm already rooting for Livia because it says Livia will accompany you. And again, like I truly haven't made it past chapter 1, but from the little that I see, I think she's going to be real instrumental and a real pillar for him. And
so it's just going back to that decisive moment in the spirit realm. I don't know what page it is. Sorry for that. We're going to have this problem throughout this thing.
It's all right.
But it's a paragraph that says, how long was I a prisoner of inexpressible torture? A little bit before that, he says, the great multitude of my victims then surrounded my anguish and suffering soul, demanding justice and reparation and bursting out in screams and wailings, right? That perish. So he's confronted with what his wrongdoings were. And then he thinks about being in that position. And that when Livia also comes in, right? I only remember glimpsing the heavenly figure of Livia, who, in the midst of the vortex of terror, held out to me her fulgent, right, her bright and loving hands. So we also know here that Livia is an important part of the story, right? We haven't met Livia yet, and Livia is Publius' current wife, and I mean current wife in terms of wife in this incarnation that he's in, that he's talking to us about. But we already give a sense of how elevated she seems to be, right? Because again, historically, women were not depicted in this favorable condition, right? And here he is bringing and breaking that perspective down and saying, my wife, I mean, I seem to recall that she was the one who kind of came in and held my hand and vouched for me and made it all better, right?
And that's surprising, one, in, I think he writes about like 20 AD or, right around the time of Christ. But it's also still surprising, around World War II, because I mean, yes, that was the time when like women were going into the workplace, men were, especially in the United States, were going out to war, women were filling those jobs. We get the
so
that iconic picture of like the woman with a bandana and like, we can do it. So that's sort of the time that this is written, and it just resonated with me a lot.
So I think what we can see here then is exactly that, like from 1939 the fact of brandishing a woman as the enlightened person in the couple was already a little bit of a little bit of a myth busting, right? Or a socially different approach, which I think that we don't think of that much because nowadays it's a little bit more, possible. But, back in the day, that's not the case, right? And you're right, we are in 31 AD. So we are in the year 31 AD. So right about the whole piece in May, he actually talks about it. And he also talks about Levi and says, I have a sense that I know her from before that life. I have a sense that we have been together through different lifetimes, right? So all that's really powerful and interesting, right?
Meanwhile, his friend keeps saying, shut it down.
But his friend, once, right, he kind of sympathizes, but he's also trying to bring him back, right?
Yeah.
And he has a great quote here earlier on the chapter that his friend says, as for questions of suffering, we must remember that the gods can test our moral virtues with the greatest threats to the fortitude of our spirit, without our having to adopt the absurd principles of the Egyptians and Greeks. Principles, mind you, this is the important part, that have reduced them to annihilation and captivity. Right? So don't go into that hocus pocus, because that stuff has made the Greeks and the Egyptians soft and has made, them.
And to bookend his comments on page 28, second to last page in the chapter, he says, after he hears everything, he's still like, I imagine him going like, wow, that was a crazy story. I wonder. And he says, considering your thoughts, even if we believe the truthfulness of the phenomenon, I still don't think we should delve too deeply into such mysterious, transcendent matters.
Yeah. Right. There's another part here. So because they dreamed too much, the illustrious Athenians became miserable slaves. Right. So yeah, just kind of like move on. But
I like his solution though. At the end he goes, you and your family should take a vacation. Like that's his solution to like, man, like he wants to take care of his friend, right? He's worried about him, but he knows his daughter's sick. He's like worried his friend is probably going to mar his reputation because he's talking about these things that are taboo.
And these are really well-known people, right? This is like the creme de la creme of Roman society. So everybody knows about these families. So the family appearance is an important thing as well, right? But the dream, though, it's not just the interesting part, because it's very powerful already that he talked to Flaminius about it. But after that, he says, I don't know if I should tell, but I'm going to tell you more. After I had the dream, as I remember seeing myself as a person, I went up to that place and I dug up, a sculpture kind of thing of who that person was, right? And then he leads his friend Flaminius to his study, basically, right? And pulls all this like parchment and papyri. What's the plural of papyrus? Papyri, I think.
Well, it's papyrus. I would say papyri.
Papyri, yeah. Right? Say that 3 times really fast. Papyri.
I'll look it up.
Right? And so they had this large wax image of family ancestors, because remember, ancestors was a really important thing. And he pulls out, right, one. Do you recognize this one? And his friend, it's like, wow, surprise, right? The name of his great grandfather is Publius Lentulus Sura, right? And his paternal great grandfather. And he was strangled nearly a century ago for his role in the Catiline Conspiracy, which is the dream that he had.
Yep.
Exactly 94 years, it says. It was exactly 94 years ago that my grandfather's father was put to death during those dreadful events, right? And then he says, now look closely at this wax figure, right? And basically it is the spitting image of Publius today. So both of them are like, whoa.
Yeah.
Right?
And the handwriting. He talks about the handwriting being the same.
Good point.
But that was interesting to me. So when I think of reincarnation, 2 things struck me. One is I don't think of people reincarnating in the same family necessarily.
No, we don't always think about that.
And I definitely don't think of people looking the same. So I got stuck on that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense too, right? Especially if you're following the same genetic line, that you would, look somewhat similar because you have the same gene pool to pull from, but there seems to be some traits that when it's close enough, the spirit still carries on. And in this case, we don't know if it was also
genetics,
a planned thing for him to be aware that he was, that encountered that realization. So it could have also been a spiritual setup and saying, we're going to put like some breadcrumbs for you to be able to make your way back to what happened, so that you detach yourself from this idea that you are all that and a bag of chips, right? So I don't know, but it's really interesting as well.
the bag of chips.
The bag of chips. Very serious conversations taking place here. And here we have it, right? We have then Publius opening his heart to Flaminius about this incredibly moving and vivid dream. And he knows like it's a different dream. He's insistent about this, right? And he says, I'm struggling with this. There's my daughter. She has this condition. We don't know what to do. His good friend says, why don't you move to better climates? Because the climate might help, at least ameliorate the peace. Why don't you go to Palestine, I think? Yeah. And it basically says, we can talk to the Caesar, we can talk to the emperor, and he can move you over there, assign you over there, and you still get your government money, right? Because they were paying a nice sum. And you can go over there, and I'll help you take care of your business here while you're there. And then we have a big review too at the end of the chapter. He says, we can't move just yet.
We're having a second baby.
We're having a second baby, right? So, and that's how he kind of, if I'm not mistaken, that's how he ends, right?
That is pretty much how it ends.
Yeah. Flaminius said an emotional goodbye to his friend and got into his luxurious litter with the help of his fleet-footed Herculean slaves. And so interesting, right? Remember, it's really like the stuff of movies, right? Like that little bed that they carry on their shoulders, which I guess was the Uber or the Times or the limo at the time in this case, right? And he makes his way out, and we find Publius then just pondering about what's going to happen, which is really chapter 2, which would be next week, and that is entitled A Slave, right?
Can't wait. This will be the first time that I will move past chapter 1.
Was it painful? Did you make it so far?
It was not painful. It was actually kind of exciting. It was fun to talk about it. I'm really curious what you all thought and what you want to know. Give us some feedback. How can we make our book club more interesting for you?
Bring your own perspective. What did you like? What did you did not like? You have questions, right? We might do a little bit of different things too. Like one of the cool things I learned I did not know was that there's a description of the houses, and there's a 7 hills of Rome, and his house was in the most affluent area, the Aventine. Exactly, one of the 7 pieces. So you get a little bit of flavor that if you like the history piece. I learned in the book that I don't know if I remember this or not, but that during the day, right, traffic in the small streets was relegated to just pedestrians. At night, you had all the commercial deliveries taking place. So it gets louder at night. So it's interesting to see how like the day-to-day of Rome was, and that his house was fancy. So there's some historical pieces in there that people want to bring that back to us later too, and do some exploration about what is a influvium or a pluribum. Like they have all these architectural terms in there too that might interest some people. It might not interest others, but there's plenty of stuff to dig into for different personalities.
So moving forward, we're going to be here every Wednesday, 8:00 Pacific time. The sessions are going to be recorded, so you can watch them later. And throughout the week, you can enter in, go into the site, leave questions, put comments. We're going to post some questions as well. Hopefully, task some of you who are going to join us to.
What do you mean? What do you mean task some of us? What are you thinking about?
You know,
the educating her.
It's
going to put us to work.
Some homework. So I think it'd be really fun to, as you all join us, those of you who want to come regularly, we'll give you teensy assignments, like coming up with some questions for our next discussion, doing some historical research about the things that Daniel mentioned that I would just butcher if I repeat them, but what are the 7 hills in Rome, or how are they different? Tell us more about traffic, just to dig in a little bit more to help us get the conversation started. Would love for somebody out there to volunteer to come to us weekly with sort of a 3-sentence summary of the chapters.
Or pull a quote out that they like.
Pull a quote out that you like. You saw me just highlighting things and writing things down. So join the work. Don't be shy. If you happen to be in San Diego, just come on over.
Hop on over.
We'll provide you with snacks. But if you're remote, use this as spiritual food for thought, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Yeah, and we hope that you join us in this learning journey. And till next time.
Have a great night. Bye.